The harsh fluorescent lights of Memorial Hospital's pediatric wing cast long shadows across the sterile hallway. But nothing could overshadow the heart-wrenching sobs echoing from room 314. Marcus Williams paused his mopping, the familiar ache in his chest tightening as he recognized the sound of a child in distress, the kind of raw, desperate crying that cut straight through to a parent's soul. At 34, Marcus had heard that same cry from his own 8-year-old son, Danny, too many times during their darkest nights. The nights when the electricity got shut off, when dinner was crackers and peanut butter again, when Daddy had to explain why they couldn't afford the field trip or the new sneakers. Being a single father and working the graveyard shift as a hospital janitor meant Marcus knew intimately the sound of a child's world falling apart. He shouldn't stop. His supervisor had already written him up twice this month for inefficient time management, and he couldn't afford to lose this job. Not when Danny needed new glasses and the rent was already 3 days late. But as another wave of desperate crying drifted from the room, Marcus found his feet moving toward the sound before his brain could stop them. Through the partially open door, he saw a small boy, maybe 6 years old, sitting rigidly on the hospital bed. His tiny fists were clenched, his face red and streaked with tears, and he was hyperventilating in that terrifying way children do when their world becomes too big and too scary to handle. A nurse knelt beside him, speaking in soothing tones, but the boy seemed trapped in his own bubble of panic. "Hey there, buddy," Marcus said softly, stepping just inside the doorway. The nurse looked up, probably ready to ask him to leave, but something in Marcus's gentle demeanor made her pause. The little boy's crying hitched, and he looked up with eyes so filled with fear and confusion that Marcus felt his heart break a little more. Without thinking, Marcus reached into his cart and pulled out a small bottle of bubble solution, or something he'd started carrying after Danny mentioned how the bubbles in the hospital gift shop had made him smile during Marcus's lunch break visits. "You know what I learned from my son?" Marcus said, unscrewing the cap and dipping the wand. "Sometimes when everything feels too big and scary, we need to remember that beautiful things can still happen." He blew gently, and a stream of iridescent bubbles floated into the room, catching the light and creating tiny rainbows that danced through the air. The boy's sobbing slowed, his eyes following the magical spheres as they drifted around him. "See that one?" Marcus pointed to a particularly large bubble. "That one's carrying all your worries away. And that little one there? That's bringing you a hug from everyone who loves you." The boy reached out tentatively, his small finger popping a bubble. For the first time, the ghost of a smile flickered across his tear-stained face. "My name's Marcus." "What's yours?" "Tyler," the boy whispered, his voice still shaky but no longer panicked. "Well, Tyler, you want to know a secret? When I'm scared, I make wishes on bubbles. You think about something that makes you happy, blow the bubble, and send that happiness out into the world." For the next 20 minutes, Marcus forgot about his mop, his supervisor, and his mounting bills. He blew bubbles and told Tyler stories about his son Danny, about how brave Tyler was being, about how the doctors and nurses were like superheroes working to help him feel better. Slowly, the little boy's breathing returned to normal, his fists unclenched, and he even giggled when Marcus made particularly funny faces while blowing the bubbles. "You're really good at this," Tyler said, catching a bubble in his palm before it could pop. "I've had lots of practice. My little boy taught me that sometimes the smallest things can make the biggest difference." What Marcus didn't know was that behind him, standing silently in the hallway, was Catherine Morrison, Tyler's mother and the CEO of Morrison Industries, one of the largest corporations in the city. She had arrived in her tailored business suit, still clutching her phone from the board meeting she'd rushed out of when the hospital called. She'd been prepared to demand answers, to take control of the situation the way she controlled everything else in her high-stakes world. Instead, she found herself frozen, watching this gentleman in a janitor's uniform doing what she with all her wealth and power had never been able to do, truly comfort her son. Catherine had been so focused on providing Tyler with the best of everything at the finest schools, the most exclusive opportunities, the most expensive toys, that she'd never learned the simple art of blowing bubbles and making wishes. She'd been so busy building an empire to secure his future that she'd missed the present moments when he needed nothing more than presence and kindness. Tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed in years began to stream down her face as she watched Tyler laugh for the first time since his father had left them 6 months ago. This stranger, this man who clearly knew financial struggle intimately, was giving her son something priceless that money couldn't buy, the feeling of being truly seen and cared for. When Marcus finally stood to leave, promising Tyler he'd check on him during his next shift, Catherine stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said softly. Marcus turned, expecting to be reprimanded for being in a patient's room. Instead, he found himself face to face with an elegant woman whose eyes were red with tears but filled with profound gratitude. "I'm Catherine Morrison, Tyler's mother. I can't thank you enough for what you just did." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "I just blew some bubbles, Mom." "Anyone would have here." "No," Catherine interrupted. "Not anyone. You have a gift. You saw my son not as a problem to be solved, but as a little boy who needed kindness. That's..." She paused, struggling for words. "That's everything." What followed was a conversation that changed both their lives. Catherine learned about Danny, about Marcus's struggle to balance work and single parenthood, about dreams deferred but never abandoned. Marcus learned about Tyler's recent trauma, about a successful woman who realized that success meant nothing if she couldn't comfort her own child. 3 weeks later, Marcus found himself in an office he never could have imagined entering, a Catherine's corner suite on the 40th floor of Morrison Tower. But he wasn't there as a janitor. Catherine had offered him a position heading up a new community outreach program, focusing on supporting single parents and their children. "I don't understand," Marcus had said during their first meeting. "I don't have an MBA or any business experience." "You have something better," Catherine had replied. "You have wisdom. You understand what families really need because you've lived it. I can teach anyone business skills, but I can't teach them to have a heart like yours." The program they built together became a model for corporate social responsibility across the country. It provided job training for single parents, after-school programs for their children, and emergency assistance for families in crisis. But more than that, it was built on the understanding that sometimes the most profound help comes not from grand gestures, but from simple acts of human kindness. On the program's first anniversary, Tyler, now thriving in school and no longer prone to panic attacks, stood beside Marcus at the ribbon-cutting ceremony. In his small hands, he held a bottle of bubble solution. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the microphone, his voice clear and confident, "my friend Marcus taught me that when we blow bubbles, we're really blowing hope into the world. Today, we're blowing hope for every family who needs to know they're not alone." As hundreds of bubbles filled the air above the crowd, Catherine watched her son and the man who had changed both their lives. She thought about that night in the hospital when everything had seemed so broken, so hopeless. She thought about how one person's decision to stop, to care, to offer comfort to a stranger had created ripples that touched hundreds of lives. Marcus caught her eye and smiled, the same gentle smile that had first calmed Tyler's fears. In his expression, she saw the truth that had taken her 40 years to understand. The most successful life isn't measured by profit margins or corner offices, but by the moments when we choose to see each other's humanity and respond with love. That evening, As Tyler played in their backyard with Danny, the two boys now inseparable best friends, Catherine sat beside Marcus on her deck. They watched their sons chase bubbles in the golden sunset, their laughter mixing with the warm evening air. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stopped that night?" Catherine asked. Marcus considered this, watching Danny help Tyler reach a particularly high bubble. "I think about it sometimes, but then I remember what I tell the kids in our program. We can't change the past, but we can fill the future with as much kindness as possible." As if summoned by his words, a single bubble drifted toward them, catching the last rays of sunlight before gently popping against Catherine's hand. In that moment, she understood what Marcus had known all along, that the most beautiful things in life are often the most fragile, the most fleeting, and the most free. And sometimes, when we are brave enough to offer them to a stranger, they transform not just that person's world, but our own.